Hundreds of skulls stacked in circles under a Mexico City building. In Naples, a vial of dried blood still miraculously turns to liquid 3 times a year. Doesn't though, locals believe disaster is coming, and across Europe, churches claim to hold the holy foreskin of Jesus. One was paraded through the streets for hundreds of years until it vanished without a trace. These are terrifying, forgotten religious artifacts. Starting in February 2015, archaeologists Raul Barrera and his team were excavating under a colonial-era building in downtown Mexico City, not far from the Templo Mayor complex. They dug until they hit the basalt floor of the Aztec period, and then hundreds of skull fragments started showing up. They had found the main skull rack of Tenochtitlan. This was the legendary structure Spanish conquistadors had written about, estimating it held 130,000 something skulls. And for hundreds of years, historians wondered, did it really exist? Or did the Spanish just make it up? Were they exaggerating things to make the Aztecs look more barbaric? The wooden poles that once held the skulls had rotted away, but the post holes were still there. Nearby, they found something even stranger. Skulls mortared together in circles, all facing inward toward an empty space in the center. To this day, nobody knows what was supposed to go there. The platform was partly excavated under the floor of a 3-story house. Because the building was historically valuable, archaeologists had to work in these narrow excavation wells about 6 feet below the floor, laying on their stomachs on wooden platforms. Sounds fun. By 2020, they'd found over 600 skulls in the tower structure, skulls of men, women, and children, which was surprising for some of the researchers, who were only expecting to find male warriors. Eduardo Matos explained the whole point was psychological warfare. Aztecs would invite friends and, more importantly, enemies into the city. They'd make sure to show them this rack of decomposing heads. Certainly one way to keep people from messing with you. In Naples Cathedral, there's a relic supposedly containing the dried blood of Saint Januarius, a bishop who was martyred around 305 CE. The blood sits in 2 glass vials inside a silver shrine. 3 times a year, massive crowds pack into the cathedral to watch if it'll liquefy. The dates are specific: the Saturday before the first Sunday in May, September 19th, and December 16th. The first documented time anyone wrote about it liquefying was back in 1389. On September 19th, 2024, Archbishop Domenico Battaglia held up the vial and declared it had turned to liquid again, saying, quote, "Every drop of this blood speaks to us of the love of God." When it doesn't liquefy though, some see it as a bad omen. War, plague, disaster, something bad is coming. Vials normally sit locked in a vault and only get brought out for these ceremonies. Whether you think it's a miracle or not, thousands of people show up every time, and the attention in that cathedral must be insane. In March 2016, archaeologists working south of Athens dug up a mass grave with about 80 male skeletons. Some of them still had iron shackles locked tight around their wrists. They died in the second half of the 7th century BCE, during this time of brutal political chaos in Athens. These were executions, not battle deaths, and the skeletons were grouped together like they'd been killed at the same time. The project director said this was the first time they could physically see the violent power struggles that eventually led to democracy in Athens. These guys were probably part of a failed political or religious faction that got wiped out. The Greek Ministry of Culture is building a permanent exhibition for the site, set to open in 2026. They'll be able to walk through and see the actual remains, a physical reminder that democracy was born out of some very brutal violence. Multiple churches across Europe claim to have the holy prepuce, literally the foreskin of Jesus Christ. The most famous one was in this small village called Calcutta, just north of Rome. The story goes that after the sack of Rome in 1527, a German soldier stole the relic and it somehow ended up there. Every January 1st, on the Feast of the Circumcision, they'd parade it through the streets, till 1983, when it just vanished. Father Don Dario Magnoni announced the relic had been stolen from his home. At the peak of the relic craze, though, there were supposedly 18 different holy foreskins floating around Europe. The Catholic Church even offered perks if you visited the one in Calcutta, up to 10 years worth of reduced time in purgatory, just for showing up to see it. Can't get in on that deal now because nobody has any idea where it went.
The heads of John the Baptist. Plural. The Umayyad Mosque in Damascus claims to have his head. The Residenz Museum in Munich also claims to have his head. The Church of San Silvestro in Rome, whose name literally translates to Saint Sylvester at the Head, also claims to have his head. 3 institutions, 3 continents, 1 skull. None of them have permitted independent scientific testing. None of them have acknowledged the other's claims. And the question of which one, if any, is telling the truth has been left unanswered for centuries. Maybe we should DNA test all 3. Maybe we shouldn't. I don't know. I guess I'll pass on that. In 828 CE, 2 Venetian merchants traveled to Alexandria and stole the bones of the Apostle Mark. And here is how they got them out of Egypt. They hid them under layers of pork and cabbage, because Muslim customs officials at the port would not touch the pork. The bones arrived in Venice. They were installed at the Basilica di San Marco and have been venerated there ever since. The problem is that the remains have never been scientifically authenticated. There are also records suggesting the Alexandrian church knew the theft was coming and swapped the bones before the merchants arrived. Whether what's in the basilica is actually the Apostle Mark, a decoy, or something else entirely has never been established. The church venerates them. The testing has not been permitted. In 1952, among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, archaeologists found something completely unlike the others, made of pure copper, and instead of a religious text, a list. 64 locations across ancient Judea, each describing a buried cache of gold and silver. The total, if accurate, worth approximately $1 billion. I felt like Austin Powers guy.
$1 million.
Access to the scroll was restricted. Publication was delayed for years. It now sits in a museum in Jordan. None of the 64 locations have ever been excavated. Whether the treasure is real, whether the locations are accurate, whether any of it still exists, nobody knows. There is a $1 billion treasure map made of copper in a museum, and nobody is digging. Mr. G never taught me this in 10th grade. I feel like I would have paid more attention if I knew treasure was on the line. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer near Nag Hammadi dug up a sealed clay jar containing early Christian texts buried for over 1,600 years. Among them was the Gospel of Thomas, not a narrative gospel, just 114 sayings attributed directly to Jesus. Things he apparently said that didn't make it into the official Bible. The texts were buried around the same time the Council of Nicaea was deciding which documents would become official scripture. The Coptic Museum in Cairo controls the originals. Independent scholarly access has been limited and contested for decades. 114 sayings attributed to Jesus suppressed for 1,600 years, found in a jar in a field. The church's official position is essentially silence.
During restoration work at St. Philibert Church in Dijon, France, workers came across something pretty freaky. Hidden behind a wall was a staircase no one had seen in hundreds of years, and it led straight down to a burial vault sealed for around 400 years. Lead archaeologist Vincent Dumas explained that inside they found wooden coffins with the remains of adults and children, and because space was limited, the, quote, bones of each individual were pushed to the sides to make room for the last deceased. The vault goes back to the 15th or 16th century, but beneath the church floor they dug up even older burials. There were slab tombs from the 11th to 13th centuries, and even deeper, they found sarcophagi from the 6th to 8th centuries. Dumas said these layers proved that each church was built on the remains of the previous one, showing almost 1,000 years of people burying their dead in the same spot. And all of this started because they were doing simple restoration work. Nuts. An Istanbul archaeologist recently came across something really cool under the ruins of the 1,500-year-old St. Polyectus Church. While digging, they found hidden underground passage that connects to 2 sealed-off rooms. Nobody even knew they were down there, but the layout seems to suggest they were part of the church, possibly used in rituals that happened back when the city was still called Constantinople. The passage and rooms aren't just bare stone, they're nicely carved and decorated, so this probably wasn't just, some random storage area. The church was originally built between 524 and 527 by Princess Anicia Juliana, who was basically trying to one-up Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora by flexing her own wealth and power. Even in ruins, the place still makes a statement. What's crazy is how much of it survived earthquakes. Mahir Polat, Deputy Secretary General of Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, said, Istanbul, which is currently struggling with earthquakes, has experienced dozens of earthquakes over the past 1500 years. However, the structure we're seeing now has managed to survive all of them. We should learn lessons from this. In Turkey, archaeologists were working at the ruins of the ancient city of Olympus when they came across a 5th century Christian church that hadn't been seen in over 1,000 years. At the entrance, they found an inscription that had been buried and ignored for centuries. Translated, it reads, "Only those on the righteous path may enter here." So it was a warning. Only people who followed the church rules could go inside. The floor of the church is covered in mosaics with leaves, vines, and other plant designs, and some have the names of the people who paid for them. They also found big storage jars and a building that looks like a temple, along with layers of Roman, Byzantine, and Hellenistic architecture. So this city was in use for a long time. Olympus was abandoned by the 12th century, so this message hasn't been seen in over 800 years. It's a simple phrase, but it does kind of tell you a lot about the city. People here cared about rules, their faith, and showed off their wealth with fancy church art. In eastern Finland, churches were hiding something I thought I read wrong at first: frog coffins. And yes, these were tiny coffins with frogs inside them. They were part of folk magic. Some churches had dozens, some even more. Archaeologists dug into one church and found about 32. According to records from the time, the coffins were pushed through ventilation hatches or buried under stone foundations. The coffins are about 15 centimeters long and would have a frog wrapped in fishing net, sometimes impaled with a needle and thread. One report says a frog's mouth was even stitched shut. Now, I mentioned folk magic before, but what was the specific point of this? Well, it was to either mess with someone's luck or protect against bad magic. One old healer described the ritual in detail. Catch a reddish frog without touching it with the bare hands. Put it on its back in a tiny coffin. Bind its legs, nail the lid through the frog's heart, and then carry it around the cowshed while chanting. The ritual could also include cow hair or pieces of the person's clothing, depending on whether it was meant to heal, curse, or protect. Between the 6th and 8th centuries CE in ancient Mesopotamia, people were burying clay bowls upside down beneath their houses. Why? Well, they were demon traps. The bowls are covered in spiral inscriptions. The text start in the center and winds outward. You could buy them in markets. Regular families would try to keep demons away from their kids or their livestock, and they'd bury them under their floors. Some of them have the homeowner's name written directly into the curse. They've also found ones with a drawing of a bound demon scratched into the clay with lines of text spiraling around it to kind of lock it in place. Hundreds of these bowls have been found across Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Scholars like Matthew Morgenstern have spent years translating them, finding curses against rival sorcerers, charms against disease, protections against Liliths, female demons that attacked newborns in the night. What gets under your skin, though, isn't the drawings or the curses. It's putting yourself in these people's shoes. They genuinely believed that without these bowls under their floors, ghastly demons were going to crawl out and come for them and their family in the night. That's along with all the living you have to worry about, too. That makes for a pretty stressful day-to-day existence, I think. On May 6, 1950, two brothers named Viggo and Emil Højgaard were cutting peat for fuel in a bog just west of Silkeborg, Denmark. They were working about 2.5 meters below the surface when they found what looked like a fresh corpse. Actually, the body was so well preserved, they thought they'd found someone who was recently killed, so they called the cops. When police arrived and learned the body was found deep in the peat, though, they realized this was something for archaeologists to handle. The man had actually been dead for over 2,300 years. The acidic, low-oxygen peat had basically mummified him. His skin had turned this leathery brown color, almost black. His hair was still there. You could see stubble on his face, but he'd been dead hundreds of years before Jesus was born. Around his neck was a braided leather noose, and his tongue was distended. This had not been a violent struggle, it was ritualistic. 2021, researchers were even able to figure out what his last meal was. It was porridge, 85% barley, and then flax and other seeds. Archaeologists believe he was likely sacrificed to the fertility goddess Nerthus, who received offerings in wetlands. The variety of seeds in his gut, many of them weeds that wouldn't usually be eaten, could mean this was kind of a special sacrificial meal. Only his head is actually real now. Back in the 50s, they just didn't have the technology to preserve an entire body like that, so the examiners decided to just keep his head and leave the rest. But in 1987, the Silkeborg Museum rebuilt the body using what was left of the bones. In December 1945, two Egyptian farmers named Muhammad and Khalifa Ali were digging for fertilizer near a cliff when they found a sealed clay jar. Muhammad was scared to break it at first, thought a jinn might be inside, but then wondered if there might be gold. He smashed the jar, but instead of gold or a demon, papyrus went flying everywhere. Inside were 12 leather-bound papyrus texts. Turned out these were alternative versions of early Christianity that the church had spent hundreds of years trying to erase. The Gospel of Thomas is full of Jesus speaking in these weird cryptic sayings. The Gospel of Philip talks about hidden spiritual knowledge being more important than faith. The codices had probably been buried by monks from a nearby monastery after non-canonical books had been condemned in 367 CE, so getting caught with these things could have gotten you executed. Manuscripts were brought together in Cairo, where scholars worked for years to translate them. The full collection wasn't published until the 70s and 80s. When archaeologists finally got their hands on these texts, they realized early Christianity wasn't this unified thing. It was a whole mess of competing ideas, and some of those ideas got buried for almost 1,600 years. In 2006, researchers at a university in Frankfurt were cataloging a private collection when they found a small gold scroll wrapped inside a lead capsule. It looked like jewelry at first, but once they carefully unrolled it, they realized it was a curse. Cursed jewelry. The text was written in Greek and dated to the 2nd or 3rd century CE, probably from Roman Egypt. The handwriting was tiny and full of spelling mistakes, probably by someone who wasn't fully literate, but at least they knew the formula for summoning spirits. That's more than I can say. The scroll listed the names of deities and invoked them to bind someone. The amulet's owner had carried someone's curse around their neck, right next to their skin. The same kind of scrolls have been found in graves and wells, but this one, being wearable, meant whoever made it wanted that dark energy close to them at all times. In 2019, a team from Associates for Biblical Research re-examined leftover dirt from an old Israeli excavation on Mount Ebal. The site, described in the Bible as the Mountain of Curses, found a small folded lead tablet. It was sealed shut, too brittle to pry open, so in 2021 they scanned it with micro-CT imaging. On the inside was an inscription that read, "Cursed, cursed, cursed, cursed by the God Yahweh," believed to date somewhere between 1200 and 1400 BCE, which would make it one of the oldest known Hebrew texts ever found. In 1933, French archaeologist Robert Dumesnil du Buisson was excavating the ancient Assyrian city of Arslan-Tash in northern Syria when he purchased 2 limestone plaques from a peasant. They were covered in tiny Phoenician script. When the writing was translated, it turned out these things were meant to keep demons out of the home. The text calls on multiple gods and explicitly mentions banishing the Lilu and Lilith, again demonic beings that preyed on humans, especially children, at night. Scholars dated them to around the 7th century BCE. Syrian houses were full of small charms and rituals meant to ward off evil like this, but these amulets stood out because of how vivid the language was. I mean, it reads like someone genuinely terrified of what might crawl through the door after dark. In Europe and even parts of North America and Australia, churches and old buildings have been found over the years hiding something kind of weird. Shoes, tiny worn shoes, shoved into chimneys, under floors, above ceilings, tucked around doors and windows. The oldest recorded one was behind the choir stalls in Winchester Cathedral, installed in 1308. Most of these shoes were used, about half belonged to kids. Archaeologist Brian Hoggard says the locations, quote, suggest that some may have been concealed as magical charms to protect the occupants of the building against evil influences such as demons, ghosts, and witches, end quote. Some may have also been meant to bless a woman with fertility or act as offerings to household spirits. A fun piece of folklore here, story goes that witches were drawn to the human scent of a shoe. and once inside they couldn't get out. Not exactly sure why that would have been the case, but basically the shoes were like little traps. Researchers have found hundreds of these hidden shoes over the years, and the tradition didn't die out until the 20th century. Even as late as 1964, a shoe was placed in the foundation of a factory for luck. In the town of Folkestone, England, a set of bones has been talked about for over 100 years. They were first dug up in 1885 inside the Church of St. Mary and St. Eanswythe, and people immediately wondered if they belonged to St. Eanswythe herself, a young nun who founded one of Britain's earliest monasteries around 660. For years, there wasn't a way to really know, but then in 2020, researchers used modern equipment to take a closer look. They found the bones were from a woman who died in her late teens or early 20s and seemed to have lived a pretty comfortable life. Radiocarbon dating placed her in the middle of the 7th century. Andrew Richardson from the Canterbury Archaeological Trust said that, yeah, it was probably Eanswythe. It makes sense. Eanswythe was a granddaughter of a king, so pretty comfortable life, and she died young. There are still some questions though. Why were her bones hidden in a wall instead of being put on display? Excavators think the answer might be the anti-Catholic Reformation. As the movement swept through England, relics considered objects of false worship were destroyed, so they might have been trying to hide the saint's remains from being torched, in a fire or something. In Hadstock, England, St. Botolph's Church has a story. For years, people thought the large piece of skin nailed to its door belonged to a Viking raider who tried to loot the church. He was flayed alive as a warning to others. But recent research has totally changed that story. Cambridge scholar Rudy MacLeod and his team used a technique called zooms, which can figure out what species skin or bone comes from. And they found the skin wasn't actually human at all, sadly. At St. Botolph's and Westminster Abbey, it was cow skin, while St. Michael and All Angels Church had horse or donkey hide. Yeah, the whole Viking skin being used on church doors thing was not an isolated incident. But MacLeod said, quote, "In the absence of any samples actually proving to be human, it looks like this story might have originated for one of the churches as a local myth first and then spread to others quickly," end quote. The myth goes way back, but the truth is way less gruesome. It's still weird though. I mean, why even stretch a bunch of animal skin over a church door and say it was from a slain Viking? As MacLeod put it, the quote, morbid fascination associated with this myth likely explains its persistence, as well as serving as deterrent to would-be church desecrators. In Venice, inside the Basilica of Saint Maria e San Donato, there's something you'd never expect to see in a church: the bones of a dragon. Or maybe you would, I don't know. I guess if there's anywhere dragon bones are going to be, I guess, an old church. The legend goes that these ribs belong to a fierce dragon that was killed by Saint Donatus, a 4th century saint whose story is almost entirely legendary. The bones didn't start out in Venice. They were taken from Cephalonia in the 1120s by the Venetian leader who took the dragon bones during one of his raids on Byzantine Greece. Alongside them came the saint's own remains. The legend says Donatus was a childhood friend of Julian the Apostate and performed a bunch of miracles before dying, including raising a woman from the dead, exorcising a demon, restoring sight to a blind woman, and finally killing the dragon that had poisoned a well. Quite a life. The so-called dragon bones are now hanging behind the altar, mostly out of sight unless you know where to look. The church doesn't even mention them on its markers. Of course, do scientists actually think they're dragon bones? No, but I do love this story. In 1866, workers doing repairs at St. Mary the Virgin in Northamptonshire came across something weird inside one of the church's pillars. They reached in and pulled out a crumbling basket, and inside that basket was a mummified human heart. Word of the find spread through the nearby village of Woodford. Some said it was the heart of a monk who haunted the church at night. Others thought it belonged to a crusader who died far from home, but whose friends had somehow managed to bring his heart all the way back to England. There's a slightly more solid lead in a document from 1280 though, which says the heart might have belonged to a local noble, Roger de Kirkton. He died in Norfolk, but apparently his heart was entombed in his home church at Woodford. No one knows for sure though. Even today, you can see the delicate mummified heart in its original spot inside the pillar, now behind glass. In Rome, the Dominican monastery keeps what's claimed to be the right arm and hand of Saint Mary Magdalene. Supposedly, it's the very arm she used to anoint Jesus' feet, which is why it's treated as especially sacred. The relic is displayed in a glass and gold container shaped like an arm, only comes out on occasion for display. This isn't the only part of Mary Magdalene that churches claim to have. Her skull is in France, various bones, hair, and a tooth are sitting in churches across Europe. The arm in Rome is probably the most famous one, and people have been coming to look at it for centuries. Does anyone really know if it's hers? Not really. There's no trail from her 1st century burial to this monastery. Most likely it showed up in the Middle Ages, when churches were desperate for holy relics to boost their status. Still, the church treats it like the real thing, and thousands of pilgrims over the years have come to see it. So at one point in time, there were over a dozen relics in Europe, said to be the foreskin of Jesus Christ. The most famous version ended up in Calcutta, a small town just outside of Rome. The story goes it was stolen from the papal relic collection during the 16th century and later hidden by a monk in Calcutta, where it stayed for centuries. Every year on January 1st, the holy prepuce would be taken out and paraded through the streets. Some believed the relic had miraculous powers, others were just kind of put off by the idea of worshipping a severed piece of skin. The Vatican didn't like the attention it was getting and eventually tried to crack down on public discussion about it, even threatening excommunication for anyone writing about it. Then in 1983, it vanished. The priest in Calcutta claimed it was stolen, but no real investigation was done. Some locals think it was taken by the church to avoid more embarrassment. Others believe it was hidden again by someone in town. Either way, it hasn't been seen since. You can still go to the town and find people who swear they saw it with their own eyes, though. Saint Clare of Assisi was one of the earliest followers of Saint Francis and founded the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares. She cut off all her hair as a symbol of her devotion to a life of poverty and faith. After her death in 1253, some of her followers held on to the little things she left behind, like strands of her hair, pieces of her habit, and clippings of her fingernails. These relics are now kept in Assisi, Italy, at the Basilica of St. Clare. If you go, you can literally look through a glass display and see locks of her hair and a few curled bits of fingernail in a decorated case. It's treated with reverence, but some folks find it kind of unsettling. There's just something a little jarring about walking through a grand cathedral only to come face to face with the preserved body parts of a long dead person. But this is nothing compared to the relics that I'm about to cover. Every year, people pack into Naples Cathedral to stare at a sealed glass vial of dried, dark red gunk. It's supposedly the BLOOD of Saint Generius. He was a 3rd century bishop who was martyred during the Roman Empire's Christian crackdowns. Of course, the red stuff is all dried up now, but it is said to liquefy right in front of people. If it liquefies, it's seen as a good omen for Naples. If it stays dry, it's considered a bad one. There have been years where it didn't liquefy, followed by major disasters like earthquakes or disease outbreaks. Church officials don't officially say it's a miracle, but they also don't quite explain it. Scientists have looked into it and say it could just be a substance that reacts to movement or temperature, but no one's allowed to open the vial and actually test it, of course. Saint Catherine of Siena was a mystic, a political advisor, and one of the most influential religious figures of the 14th century. After her death in 1380, her body was buried in Rome, but her hometown of Siena wasn't too happy about that, so a few years later, someone decided to smuggle her head back. The story goes that her followers hid it in a sack and tried to sneak it out of Rome, but were stopped at the gates. They prayed, and when the guards looked inside, they saw rose petals instead of a human head. Miraculously, they were allowed through. When they got back to Siena, the petals had turned back into Catherine's actual mummified head. That head now sits in a glass case in the Basilica of San Domenico. It's been there ever since. Her actual face is dark, leathery, and shrunken, as you'd expect from something that's over 600 years old, but it's also encased in a really beautiful display, so it looks more presentable than you'd think a preserved human skull with some skin still clinging onto it would be. In the Basilica of Santa Sabina in Rome, there's a large black beat up chunk of stone. According to legend, this is the very same stone the devil hurled at St. Dominic while he was deep in prayer. The story says Satan, furious that Dominic was preaching and converting too many people, launched the stone at him inside the basilica. It missed, slamming into the floor instead. Supposedly there were claw-like marks and scorched patterns left on the stone, marks that are still visible today. Whether those grooves are from claws or just the result of natural erosion doesn't really matter to the church. What matters is the symbolism. The devil tried to stop Dominic and he failed. Ever since, the devil's stone has been kept inside the basilica. Beneath the floor of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, right under the massive altar, there is a small tomb carved into rock. Inside that tomb are bones the Catholic Church believes belong to St. Peter himself. The Apostle Jesus supposedly called the rock on which the church would be built. The bones were discovered in the 1940s during secret excavations ordered by Pope Pius XII. For years, their identity was kept hidden while researchers quietly tried to confirm if they were really Peter's. In the 60s, one archaeologist working with the project announced that they'd found evidence. The bones were from a man in his 60s, buried in a place marked with graffiti that read something like, "Peter is here." In 2013, Pope Francis publicly displayed the bones for the first time, 8 fragments held in a bronze box. But not everyone is convinced. There's still debate over whether these bones actually belong to Peter, or if they were even buried there originally. Some argue they were moved or planted much later on. Either way, the church treats them as sacred. They're not shown to the public often, and when they are, it is a big deal. St. Francis Xavier died in 1552 on a small island off the coast of China while waiting for a boat to mainland Asia. His body was buried in a makeshift coffin in the hot, humid ground, basically the worst place to preserve a corpse. But when his remains were dug up a couple months later to be moved, people claimed the body hadn't decayed, and that's when the story of his incorruptibility started. Eventually, his body was brought to Goa, India, and put on display in a glass coffin where it still rests today. The church calls it a miracle, a sign of divine favor. But depending on who you ask, the body doesn't exactly look untouched. Over the years, chunks have been removed for relics. His right arm is in Rome, his nose has deteriorated, and the skin has darkened and shriveled. But considering how old it is, I guess it's not the worst. It's definitely not mummified in the Egyptian sense, but it's also not a pile of bones. Pilgrims still traveled to see it, and every 10 years or so, the church would parade the body through the streets. That doesn't really happen anymore, but the coffin's still there, attracting people from all over the world who want to see the so-called miracle up close. This one sounds made up, but it is not. There's a church in Bethlehem, the Chapel of the Milk Grotto, that claims to be the spot where Mary breastfed baby Jesus. According to tradition, a few drops of her milk spilled onto the cave floor and turned the stone pure white. That stone, now considered holy, was ground into powder and given to pilgrims starting centuries ago. Today, they're still doing it, sort of. For about $2, visitors can buy packets of white powder made from the same limestone, blessed by monks, and marketed as a kind of miracle cure. The idea is that if you mix it into water and drink it, could cure illness, infertility, or whatever else you're struggling with. It's not exactly FDA approved, but some people swear by it. The church doesn't officially say it's Mary's milk, but the legend is still very much present here. The Catholic Church has a thing for body parts, and St. Francis Xavier's arm is one of the more famous examples. This is the same Francis Xavier from earlier, the 16th century missionary, whose body is on display in Goa. His right arm, though, was chopped off and sent to Rome in 1614. Why the arm? Well, because according to legend, that's the arm he used to baptize more than 100,000 people. For centuries, the severed limbs sat in the church of the Gesù in Rome, perfectly mummified. The hand still posed as if mid-blessing. In 2018, the church allowed the arm to go on tour across Canada for the first time, and there were huge crowds. People waited in line for hours just to catch a glimpse of it in its glass case. Saint Dacian isn't exactly a household name, which makes his relic even weirder. They're kept in the Church of the Most Holy Redeemer in Manhattan, a pretty unassuming place in the middle of New York City. Back in the 19th century, a wealthy Italian woman donated what she claimed were the bones of Saint Dacian to the church. According to the story, Dacian was an early Christian martyr killed during Roman persecutions. The bones are kept in a glass case under the altar, dressed in fine robes, resting on velvet cushions. There's no solid proof that the bones belong to him, though. In fact, there's always been this rumor they might actually be the remains of a 19th century New York policeman who died protecting the church from anti-Catholic rioters. There's no way to prove it, and the church hasn't exactly rushed to get the bones' DNA tested. Either way, the relics are still there, laid out like a saint from ancient times. Golden crown, embroidered clothes, and all. Saint Mary Magdalene's right arm and hand are housed at the Dominican monastery in Rome. The arm is believed to be the same one she used to anoint Jesus' feet, which is why it's considered especially sacred. It's displayed in this beautiful glass and gold container shaped like an arm. It's kept under tight security and only occasionally brought out for people to see. This isn't the only body part of Mary Magdalene claimed by churches. Her supposed skull is in France. Other small relics like bones, hair, even a tooth have also been claimed by churches across Europe. The arm in Rome has been there for a very long time and is probably the best known. Whether it's actually hers, though, is up for debate. There's no solid trail from her burial to where the relic ended up. Like a lot of so-called holy relics, it probably turned up during the Middle Ages when churches were desperate for sacred items to boost their status. Still, the church has treated this one like the real deal for centuries. The Sudarium of Oviedo is a stained cloth that's believed to have been wrapped around the head of Jesus after his crucifixion. It's not the same as the Shroud of Turin, which shows a full body image, supposedly. This one's just a smaller cloth, about 34 by 21 inches, kept in a cathedral in northern Spain. And the story goes, it was taken out of Jerusalem in the 7th century to escape Persian invaders, then moved through North Africa and eventually brought to Spain by Christians fleeing Muslim invasions. It's been in Oviedo since at least the 800s, and there are records from that time that mention it being kept there. Unlike the Shroud of Turin, the Sudarium doesn't get much international attention, but it's a big deal in Spain. It's only shown to the public a few times a year, and the rest of the time it's locked away in a sealed case. It's one of the oldest and most mysterious relics associated with Jesus. Also known as the Spear of Destiny, the Holy Lance is said to be the spear that a Roman soldier called Longinus used to stab Jesus in the side while he was dying on the cross. The Gospel of John mentions this, and over time, people started claiming they had the actual weapon. The most famous one is kept in the Hofburg Palace in Austria. It's a long iron spear with a small slit down the middle where a nail, allegedly from the crucifixion, was embedded. The lance became more than just a relic. In the Middle Ages, it was seen as a symbol of power, especially by the Holy Roman emperors. Charlemagne is said to have taken it into battle, and after that it got passed down through different emperors as a kind of holy symbol of power. During World War II, it even caught the attention of the Third Reich, who believed the lance would give their army supernatural powers. It was taken by the Germans in 1938, and it stayed with them until US troops recovered it in 1945. There are actually multiple holy lances around the world. There's one in Armenia, one in the Vatican, and another in Paris, but the Vienna spear in Austria is probably the most famous. The full skeleton of Saint Boniface of Tarsus is kept on display in the Church of St. Martin and St. Nicholas in Munich. It's been completely coated in gold and silver, decorated with gems and dressed in elaborate robes. St. Boniface was a Roman soldier who converted to Christianity and was martyred in the 4th century. According to legend, he refused to worship the Roman gods and was beheaded for it. His remains were supposedly moved to Rome, then to Germany centuries later, where they were turned into what's known as a catacomb saint. These were skeletons dug up from Roman catacombs, given names, and sent across Europe to churches that needed a relic. In Boniface's case, the bones were wrapped in gold and paraded as the real thing, even though there's really no actual proof they belonged to the real Boniface. Whether the bones belong to him or not, though, the display is really something to see. St. Oliver Plunkett's head is on display in St. Peter's Church in Ireland. It's dark, leathery, and shriveled, but you can still make out the facial features, even some strands of hair. People still come from all over the world to see it, and that's not surprising, and it's quite the history. Plunkett was born in 1625 and became the Archbishop of Armagh and Primate of all Ireland during the time when being a Catholic leader could get you killed. English authorities were cracking down hard on Catholicism in Ireland. Plunkett was seen as a threat. In 1679, he was accused of plotting to bring French forces into Ireland to stir up rebellion. There wasn't any real evidence, but that didn't matter. He was dragged to London, given a sham trial, and convicted of high treason. On July 1st, 1681, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. His remains were buried in 2 different places, but his head ended up in the hands of his relatives, eventually making its way to a convent run by one of his grandnieces, and it stayed there, hidden, until 1921, when it was brought to St. Peter's, where it still sits today. Sitting under a regular neighborhood in Malta is an underground burial site that was built over 5,000 years ago. It's called the Hypogeum of Halsaflini. It's basically a giant cave system carved into the rock, with rooms and tunnels where around 7,000 people were buried. The bodies were stacked in layers, sometimes with pottery or statues buried along with them. One room, called the Oracle Room, is famous because if you make noise in there, the sound bounces perfectly around the space. It was obviously designed that way on purpose, maybe to use chanting or music in their ceremonies. This place was accidentally discovered in 1902 when workers digging for a new building broke through the cave roof. Since then, archaeologists have found all kinds of bones, tools, and artifacts, like the little statue known as the Sleeping Lady. This is one of the oldest underground cemeteries we know about, showing how seriously ancient people took their burial rituals. In Szczecin, Malta, a routine repair job in the late 60s revealed something disturbing under St. Catherine's Old Church. There were 3 hidden tunnels packed with human skeletons. Archaeologists later found that these bones belonged to around 90 people. Some moved from old cemeteries, others may be victims of a 1614 Ottoman raid. The tunnels have been sealed up and forgotten for decades. Alongside the skeletons, they found artifacts like Byzantine-style crosses, old coins, pieces of medieval chainmail armor. They're not exactly sure why the bones were buried like this, but historians think the tunnels may have been used to hide remains during wartime or to store bones moved from church cemeteries. See, back in the day, especially during war, disease outbreaks, or raids, churches sometimes had to dig up cemeteries to make space or protect the dead from being desecrated. So instead of reburying the bones in public graveyards, they'd sometimes stash them in ossuaries or in tunnels under the church. On the eastern edge of Jerusalem, there is a small religious site called the Chapel of the Ascension. It marks the spot where Christians believe Jesus ascended into heaven. The site has changed hands a bunch of times over the centuries. It started as a Christian church, was later converted into a mosque, and now has parts of both. But here's the part most people don't know about. Underneath, there's a hidden stone crypt that dates back about 1,500 years. You can get to it by going down a short flight of steps. The chamber is small and pretty bare. There are stone benches carved into the walls and a few old inscriptions in Greek that mention early Christian names. Archaeologists say it was probably a burial chamber from the Byzantine period, back when churches often doubled as tombs for religious leaders. Workers restoring the 12th century church of Saint Philbert in France accidentally found a hidden staircase buried under the sanctuary. The restoration started because the church's old concrete slab installed in the 70s had trapped salt under the building, causing serious damage to the foundation. So as workers dug about 10 feet down, they came across a 400-year-old sealed vault that no one knew existed. Inside the chamber, archaeologists found coffins holding adults and children, bodies wrapped in shrouds and layered to make more room. There were also 6 stone sarcophagi dating back about 1,500 years. A few rare coins, 2 rosaries were also found, but nothing flashy. It was more about the bones and structure than the treasure. INRAP, France's National Archaeology Institute, officially confirmed the discovery in 2025. For generations, people in Atlixco, Mexico have passed down stories about a hidden indigenous temple buried under a Catholic chapel on San Miguel Hill. According to the legend, long before the Spanish built the church that's there now, the Nahua people had their own sacred temple called a Teocalli, right on that same hill. Well, in 2023, a team from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History found actual proof while doing reinforcement work on the chapel. Archaeologists found pre-Hispanic clay pots stone tools and decorative ornaments buried under the church. When they dug down deeper, they found walls and flooring from the ancient temple, just a few feet under the modern foundation. When Saint Anthony of Padua died in 1231, his body was buried like anyone else's, but when church officials exhumed his remains about 30 years later, they made a disturbing discovery. His tongue was perfectly preserved, not mummified, not hardened or shriveled. It was said that it was still red and soft, like it had come from a living person. Alongside it, his lower jawbone and vocal cords were also in strangely good shape. The church took this as a divine sign, claiming it was God's way of honoring Anthony's preaching. So they grabbed his tongue and jaw and put them on display in the Basilica of St. Anthony of Padua in Italy, where they're still kept today. Camillus de Lellis was a 16th century priest who dedicated his life to caring for the sick and dying. When he died in 1614, his heart was removed and kept as a sacred relic. That heart has been touring the world ever since. It's traveled to countries like Ireland, the Philippines, and Italy, often arriving in a gold box or a glass container. The church presents it as a symbol of compassion, but it's also no question an actual human organ that's over 400 years old. You can still see it today at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Rome, where it sits behind a small plaque and some gold trim. The thing is blackened and shriveled from age, but you can still tell that, yep, that's a human heart. One story goes that it was tested during an autopsy and found to be enlarged from love. So wherever it goes, people line up to kiss the box or pray in front of it. The crown of thorns is believed to be the one placed on Jesus' head before his crucifixion. The main relic is kept in Paris in the Notre Dame Cathedral, but it was originally brought to the city by King Louis IX in the 1200s. He got it from the Byzantine emperor and supposedly paid more for it than the actual building of St. Chapel, which he then had built just to house the crown. It's been in France ever since, guarded and passed along by royalty, then the church. The crown is a woven circle made of rushes. It doesn't have any thorns on it anymore. Those were removed and handed out to different churches centuries ago. There are thorn relics scattered across Europe, all said to come from this crown. Whether or not they actually do is a different story, though. During the Notre Dame fire in 2019, this relic was one of the main things saved. Firefighters and clergy went in and got it out before the roof collapsed. Today, it's kept in a secure space and only brought out on special occasions. There are several relics around the world claiming to be the severed head of St. John the Baptist. The most well-known is the Amiens Cathedral in France. It was supposedly brought there in 1206 by a crusader named Wallon de Sarthe, who took it from Constantinople. The skull is kept in this really elaborate gold-plated reliquary, and it's been a major pilgrimage site for centuries, but it's not the only head of John the Baptist out there. Another one is in the Basilica of San Silvestro in Rome. There's also a version in Munich and one in Syria. The one in Rome might be the head of a different saint who happened to share the same name. The German and Syrian relics are usually kept mostly out of view, wrapped in cloth, so who knows? Obviously, John the Baptist didn't have 4 heads, so not all of these can be real. Scholars generally consider the one in France to be the most credible, based on its history, the way it was acquired, and the fact that an entire cathedral was built just to house it. Saint Teresa of Avila was a Spanish nun and mystic who died in 1582. When her body was exhumed, and it was exhumed several times after her death, it was reported to be incorrupt, meaning it hadn't decayed like a normal corpse. This was considered a sign of holiness, so the church decided to hold on to her body, but they didn't keep it in one piece. Over the years, her remains were divided and sent to different churches and convents across Europe. Her heart is kept in the convent of the Incarnation in Avila. Her left arm and hand are displayed in a glass case in Rome. Her right foot is in Lisbon. Other parts, including a piece of her jaw and a finger, are held in other churches across the globe. The church preserved and spread her remains as holy relics, each one drawing its own crowd of pilgrims. Unsurprisingly, the heart's gotten the most attention. It's also known for its visible scarring, which some say was caused by divine visions Teresa described during her life. In July of 2025, archaeologists were digging under the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower of London when they made a pretty grim discovery. They found a bunch of skeletons buried under the floor, and based on early testing, a bunch of them probably died during the Black Death in the 14th century. Under one of the most famous tourist sites in England, there's a massive grave from one of the worst pandemics in human history. They also found signs that some of the burials were earlier nobles, buried near the altar, which was a status thing back then, but others were clearly hastily buried, again probably plague victims. And there's no indication the ground was sanitized or protected, it was just bodies on top of bodies. This church is still used for services and ceremonies, so it's pretty creepy that all of this was just lying underfoot, and not all that deep. Some bones were sitting just a few feet below the floor. Makes you wonder what else is buried under old churches, cause this wasn't even supposed to be an excavation originally. They were just doing renovations when they found them. You may not know this, but a lot of people die, and they've been dying for a very long time. There are a lot of bodies to bury. So how did ancient cities handle running out of space? Well, in Ghent, Belgium, they dug up old cemeteries and built 9 walls made entirely out of human bones. Under St. Bova's Cathedral, archaeologist Yannick de Gries, who led the dig, said, "We have never seen structures like walls which are intentionally built with human bones," end quote. So these walls are mostly made from adult thigh and shin bones, mixed with some broken skulls, but the smaller or more fragile bones like ribs, vertebrae, or children's bones, they weren't used. Even arm bones were left out, probably because they didn't fit right, size-wise. The bones date back to the 1400s, but the walls were probably built in the 16 or 1700s. Above the walls, archaeologists found full skeletons from a newer cemetery, meaning people kept burying bodies on top of these bone walls after they went up. De Gries explained that the, quote, faithful believed in a resurrection of the body. The bones were considered the most important part, end quote. So it might seem creepy now, but building these walls was seen as a respectful and practical way to honor the dead, making room without tossing bones out. News of this came out in 2024. Under a church in northern Poland, archaeologists made a seriously creepy discovery, a so-called vampire tomb with a sickle placed around the skeleton's neck. This was found during conservation work at the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Actually, the first time a vampire burial like this has been uncovered inside a church. The sickle was probably meant to decapitate the supposed vampire if he ever tried to rise from the dead. Archaeologist Dr. Justina Karkas studied the remains and said the skull with numerous injuries indicates the man had many deep scars on his face during his life. During one of the blows, he also lost some of his teeth. He looked different than average people, and that can be scary, end quote. She added that the man who died in the 17th century was actually accused of vampirism back then. Vampire burials with sickles aren't really unheard of in Poland or really across Europe. Legends warned about the dead coming back to torment the living. So to stop these restless souls, people would bury bodies with sickles around the neck, bind their hands and feet, or bury them face down. Back in 2022, archaeologists were digging under the Temple of Taposiris Magna near Alexandria, Egypt, when they came across a massive underground tunnel cut straight into solid rock. The thing runs for over 4,300 feet, sits 43 feet underground, and was described by the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism as a, quote, geometric miracle because of how precise the construction is. It's nearly 7 feet tall, just wide enough for someone to walk through, and eerily straight. It runs under a temple dedicated to Osiris. Some believe it could lead to Cleopatra's lost tomb, which is why the whole dig started in the first place. Archaeologist Dr. Kathleen Martinez, who's been leading the excavation for years, has already found coins, statues of Isis, pottery, underground chambers nearby. Some parts of the tunnel are flooded and it's just too fragile to fully excavate right now, but what they've seen so far has blown them away. Nobody knows what it was really used for, but the fact that it stayed hidden for over 2,000 years under what became a religious site, and that it's still mostly unexplored, it makes it one of the most interesting finds in recent archaeology in Egypt. There's a cave under the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem that most people have never seen. It's called the Well of Souls, and it sits right under the foundation stone, a sacred place in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. You reach it by going down a narrow staircase, but it's closed off to the public now and hasn't been open for years. The room's just a simple chamber carved out of limestone. The name Well of Souls came from medieval Islamic legends, claiming it was a place where souls waited for judgment. But that's said to be more folklore than anything else. It was also known to Crusaders as the Holy of Holies because they thought it marked the inner sanctum of the old Jewish temple, but modern scholars say that sacred space was probably above above the rock, not inside it. The place hasn't been studied properly and barely anyone gets to see it, but it's still there, sitting under one of the most fought over religious buildings on Earth. A town in southern Turkey, archaeologists think they may have just found the real coffin of the original St. Nicholas, the guy who inspired Santa Claus. The stone sarcophagus was found at the Church of St. Nicholas, which has been an excavation site since the late 80s. The limestone coffin is about 6 feet long, buried 5 feet down, and was found in a 2-story annex of the church. According to Associate Professor Ebru Fatma Fandik, that they didn't even realize they were digging into a burial site until animal bones and clay lamps started showing up. That's when they hit the sarcophagus. St. Nicholas died in 343 and was buried at this site. Later, a grander church was built over it under Emperor Theodosius II, and that's when his remains were supposedly moved into this sarcophagus. In 1087, a group of sailors from Bari, Italy, broke into his tomb and took most of his bones back to their city. They placed them in a new shrine at the Basilica di San Nicola, where they're still kept today. But not all the bones were taken. During the First Crusade, around 1099, another group, this time from Venice, raided what was left of the tomb and took the remaining bones. So, in 1953, scientists confirmed that the bones from both cities came from the same person, but whether that's actually St. Nick is still up for debate. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, one of the most sacred places in Christianity, archaeologists recently found something that had been sitting in plain sight for centuries. It's a massive stone altar from the Crusader period, dating back to the 1100s. For years, people thought it was just part of the wall, mostly because it was covered in layers of graffiti and chunks of fallen stone. But once researchers took a closer look, they realized that this thing had been deliberately carved and set in place as part of the original Crusader structure. It's built from massive limestone blocks, including one with a cross carved right into it. According to archaeologist David Gurvich, we've talked about a place where people believe Jesus was buried, so to uncover part of a forgotten altar from the Crusader period is huge. It had been partially destroyed over time, and a lot of it was buried under hundreds of years' worth of rubble. In Reading, England, a church relic resurfaced that people thought was lost forever. A mummified human hand said to belong to St. James the Apostle. It originally came from Reading Abbey, a huge medieval monastery founded in 1121 by King Henry I. During the 1500s, when King Henry VIII shut down England's monasteries and looted them, a lot of relics disappeared. Somehow this one survived though. It was hidden inside an iron box and rediscovered centuries later by workers doing repairs. Eventually, it made its way to St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church in Marlow, where it stayed locked away for years. The hand was, of course, dried and shriveled and partially wrapped in fabric, but it was still clearly human. Went back on display briefly in 2018 before being sent to be studied. Experts can't 100% prove it belonged to James the Apostle, but based on its age, the location, and how relics were handled at the time, it fits. In 2002, a collector went public with a limestone bone box known as an ossuary that had an inscription scratched into the side: James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. If it's legit, that's a huge deal. It would be the only known artifact that actually names Jesus of Nazareth. The box itself is real, dates back to the 1st century. Experts checked the aging on the stone, the weathering, and the letters, all of it, but big question was whether the inscription was added much later to, boost its value. That started one of the longest and most expensive court battles in archaeology. The Israeli Antiquities Authority charged the owner with forgery. The whole thing turned into a circus. After years of trial, the charges were dropped. The science couldn't prove the inscription was fake. Some people still doubt it, but no one's been able to say for sure it's modern. In 2023, archaeologists in Germany found something strange in a Roman-era grave. A silver scroll buried with a man who died nearly 1800 years before. When they carefully unrolled the scroll, found it was inscribed with 18 lines of Greek writing, including the names of Jesus, Mary, and several Christian saints. That alone was wild, because this was found in Frankfurt, way north of where Christianity was thought to have spread at the time. The guy was buried sometime between 230 and 270 CE, which means Christians were already up there way earlier than anyone thought about 100 years ahead of the usual timeline. Researchers say the writing on the scroll was meant to act like a charm or spiritual protection. The scroll itself is tiny, just a few inches long, and was buried in an iron capsule next to the man's remains. According to archaeologist Dr. Erwin Emmerling, this is the earliest physical evidence of Christianity in this region, and it changes what we thought we knew about how fast it spread. In 2023, construction crews were doing work near an old Dominican monastery in Poland when they cracked open something really cool, a medieval knight's tomb. It had a massive stone slab with a full carving of a knight in armor, sword, shield, all of it. And when archaeologists lifted it, there was a skeleton laid out perfectly underneath, exactly where you'd expect him to be. The carving was done on limestone from Gotland, which is a Swedish island. The knight was tall, probably someone important, and this grave was built to show it. The carving had symbols like a coat of arms, so whoever buried him wanted people to know exactly who he was, or at least that he was worth remembering. The area used to be a church cemetery way back in the 12th century, and this tomb probably dates to the 1200s or 1300s. And fun fact, the whole thing was under what used to be an ice cream shop. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is supposed to be the spot where Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected. It's one of the most famous religious sites in the world, but while restoring part of the floor, researchers found something small but weirdly important: ancient seeds. They dug down and found traces of grape seeds, olive pits, and pollen buried in the soil under the church. Now, that doesn't sound all that exciting, but those plants match up with the gospel descriptions of a garden being nearby at the time of the crucifixion. Grapes and olives were big in that region, especially for things like wine and oil used in rituals, so finding that kind of evidence under the building is kind of cool. The seeds were found in layers that date back about 2,000 years, so the timeline lines up as well. Doesn't prove every detail of the story, obviously, but it's enough to make archaeologists pretty excited. Right near the southern wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, archaeologists were digging in a spot known as the Opal, and ended up finding a stash of Byzantine gold. They found a small stash of gold buried in the floor, like actual treasure. There were 36 gold coins, a gold bar, 2 earrings, and a round medallion engraved with a menorah, a Torah scroll, and a shofar. That medallion is cool because it's Jewish imagery, but it was found in a Christian-era building. The coins date back to around the early 600s, right before the Persian army rolled through the city, so it looks like someone buried their valuables before things got ugly and just never made it back. It sat undisturbed for 1,400 years. The fact that Jewish religious symbols were found inside a Christian-era home also shows that this part of the city wasn't strictly divided. People were living close together, even if they didn't believe the same things, and all that info came from a handful of gold buried in someone's floor. Archaeologists digging in northern Ethiopia found the ruins of a 4th century Christian church. It's the oldest one discovered so far in sub-Saharan Africa. The site's called Beta Samati, and it used to be part of the Aksumite Empire, a big trade hub back in the day. The church was built in basilica style with stone walls, columns, and a central platform that lines up with early Christian designs from the Roman world. Found crosses, ceramic incense burners, carved pendants, a gold ring with a bull's head on it. That ring probably came from somewhere outside Ethiopia, maybe traded in from Jordan or Arabia. There were also dozens of small animal figurines, mostly of cattle, scattered around the site. Inscriptions found inside mention Christ by name, which is a big deal considering how early this site is. This means Christianity had, of course, already reached this part of Africa by the early 300s, so way earlier than most people thought. The area was connected to trading routes that stretched all the way to the Middle East, so ideas, goods, and religions were constantly flowing through. And in 2021, archaeologists working in northern Jordan explored an old underground church built inside a cave, and inside it, they came across a tiny lead scroll covered in ancient writing. The church had been carved into the rock and might be one of the earliest places where Christians gathered in secret. The scroll was tightly rolled, only about the size of a matchstick, so they had to scan it with high-res imaging to even read what was inside. The writing's in ancient Hebrew, and even though some of it still hasn't been fully decoded, early scans showed names linked to Jesus and what might be early Christian symbols. The scroll might have been used like a prayer or a kind of protective charm, something people back then would have kept hidden from Roman authorities, which is why this was found buried under the church's altar. Researchers are still being cautious about dating it, but think it could push back written references to early Christianity by decades, maybe even from the 1st century. If that's the case, this could be one of the earliest written traces of Christianity outside of Jerusalem.
The Hajar al-Aswad is embedded in the eastern corner of the Kaaba, the black cubic structure at the center of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam. At some point in history, the stone was broken into fragments, now held together by a silver frame. Millions of pilgrims attempt to kiss or touch it, and here is what stays with you. It has never been scientifically studied. Non-Muslims are forbidden from entering Mecca. Saudi authorities have never permitted independent testing. Whether the stone is a meteorite, volcanic basalt, or something else entirely has never been established by science. The most kissed object on Earth, and no scientist has ever been allowed to examine what it actually is. In Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, in the Chamber of Sacred Relics, there is a golden casket containing the mantle of the Prophet Muhammad, one of 2 surviving mantles said to have belonged to Muhammad himself. The room has a hafiz, someone who has memorized the entire Quran, reciting continuously 24 hours a day without stopping. The casket is opened once a year during Ramadan. Scientific examination has never been permitted, whether it dates to the 7th century, whether it was actually Muhammad's. Nobody outside a small circle of Turkish religious authorities knows. A man recites the Quran over it every hour of every day, while the questions science could answer remain unanswered. In ancient Rome, the Palladium was a small wooden statue the Romans believed had fallen from the sky. As long as it was in Rome, the city could not fall. The Vestal Virgins guarded it. When Emperor Constantine moved his capital to Constantinople in 330 CE, he reportedly took it with him and buried it beneath the base of his column, the Column of Constantine, which still stands in Istanbul today. It has never been excavated. Whether the object the Romans believe protected their entire empire is buried under a column in the middle of a modern city, nobody really knows because nobody's been allowed to look. In 2011, the Supreme Court of India ordered the opening of the vaults beneath the Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple in Kerala. 5 vaults were opened. Inside were gold statues, jeweled crowns, ancient coins, diamonds, $22 billion in treasure, the largest discovery of hidden temple wealth in recorded history. There was a 6th vault. The priests said it was protected by divine serpents and could only be opened through a specific ritual no one alive knows how to perform. The Supreme Court declined to open it. In 2020, they declined again. Nobody has opened Vault B. Whatever is in there is sitting behind $22 billion in confirmed treasure in a vault that an entire Supreme Court refused to open twice. That's not a decision you make lightly. There's a reason for that. In 1912, a rare book dealer purchased a manuscript from a Jesuit college near Rome, sold secretly to avoid Italian government confiscation. The manuscript had previously belonged to Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who paid an enormous sum for it in the 1580s. It is 240 pages, written entirely in an unknown script, filled with illustrations of unidentifiable plants, astronomical diagrams, and figures bathing in interconnected pools. Carbon dated to 1404 to 1438, in over a century of study involving professional cryptographers, linguists, and AI systems, not a single word has been definitively decoded. It's passed through the hands of a Holy Roman Emperor, a Jesuit library, and a secret sale before landing at Yale University, where it sits today. The most studied, unread document in human history, 600 years old, and whatever it says, nobody knows. In the city of Axum, inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims to hold the original Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest described in Exodus, built under Moses' direction, said to have housed the Ten Commandments. The protocol the church has maintained for centuries is this: one monk is appointed guardian for life. He lives beside the chapel. He never leaves the compound. He is the only human being permitted inside the room where the ark is kept. Not the Ethiopian patriarch, not the head of state, not any scientist, not any foreign dignitary, not even the Pope. When the guardian dies, he appoints his successor. That is the entire system. No verification, no testing, no photographs, no outside examination of any kind. Whether the ark is actually in that room, nobody except the guardian has ever seen it, and the guardian is certainly not talking. The most sought-after religious artifact in human history, in a room in Ethiopia with one man standing between it and the entire world. He has been saying no for a very long time.
Countdown.
In Germany, there's a robe. According to tradition, it is the seamless garment Jesus wore during the crucifixion, the one Roman soldiers gambled for at the foot of the cross. The robe has been in Trier's possession since at least the 12th century, when Empress Helena allegedly brought it back from Jerusalem. It is not on permanent display. In the last 200 years, it has been exhibited publicly exactly 4 times. In 1891, 1933, 1959, and 1996, and each exhibition drew millions of pilgrims. Here is what nobody seems to want to address. The holy coat of Trier has never been carbon dated. Not once. Scientists can observe it from a distance during those rare exhibitions, but they cannot test it. Whether the church is afraid what dating might reveal, or whether they genuinely consider testing a sacred garment inappropriate, the answer so far has been the same: no. Most people have heard of the Shroud of Turin. Almost nobody has heard of its lesser-known companion. The sudarium is a smaller cloth kept in a locked silver chest inside a chapel in Oviedo Cathedral in northern Spain, and according to tradition, it was used to cover Jesus' face immediately after the crucifixion. It has been in this cathedral since at least the 8th century. The chest was recorded as having gone unopened for hundreds of years before a formal opening was finally conducted in 1075 in the presence of King Alfonso VI, and even that was treated as a sacred ceremony rather than a scientific examination. Today, the sudarium is displayed to the public 3 times a year. 3. For the rest of the year, it goes back in the chest, back in the locked chapel. Limited scientific analysis has found blood type AB on the cloth, which matches the Shroud of Turin, and pollen traces consistent with the Jerusalem region. Comprehensive independent study has not been permitted. The chest locks. End of discussion. 3 times a year in Naples Cathedral, something happens that the church describes as a miracle. The dried, solidified blood of San Genaro, a 4th century bishop martyred in 305 CE, liquefies inside 2 sealed glass vials. The crowd cheers, the archbishop holds them up, then the vials go back in the vault. Scientists have proposed that a phenomenon called thixotropy could explain it. Certain substances appear solid until agitated, and then they become liquid. Testing that theory would require opening the vials and analyzing what's actually inside. The church has, of course, refused to allow that. The containers have never been opened for scientific examination, not once in 600 years of documented history. What's in those vials, whether it's actually blood, whether it's actually from the 4th century, whether there's a physical explanation for what happens 3 times a year, is something science currently cannot answer because the church will not let it ask the question properly. According to Catholic tradition, a woman named Veronica wiped the face of Jesus on his way to Calvary, and his image was miraculously imprinted on her cloth. The veil has been kept in the Vatican since at least the 8th century. It is shown to the public exactly once a year, on the 5th Sunday of Lent, when a canon holds it up briefly from a high balcony inside St. Peter's Basilica, at a considerable distance from the crowd below. For the rest of the year, it lives in a sealed chapel that almost no one is permitted to enter. The last scholar allowed anywhere near it was a Jesuit priest in 1907 who reported that the image had faded almost entirely, that almost nothing was visible on the cloth. The Vatican has not permitted another close examination since. So what is being kept in that sealed chapel and displayed once a year from a balcony? Apparently, that is not information that we need. In the basement chapel of the Basilica of Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome, there is a fragment of walnut wood about 25 centimeters long. It is claimed to be the sign nailed above Jesus at the crucifixion, the one that read Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. You can visit it. You can see the faint inscriptions. What you cannot do is independently date it or comprehensively study it because the church controls access tightly. The limited analysis that has been done revealed something odd. The Hebrew inscription runs right to left, which is correct, but the Latin and Greek inscriptions also appear to run right to left, which is not standard for either language. Whether that makes it more or less authentic is something scholars genuinely disagree about. What they agree on is that the full independent testing that would settle the question has not been permitted. It sits in its display case and the church decides who gets close to it and when. In 1868, British forces raided the fortress of Magdala in Ethiopia and removed hundreds of sacred objects, including 11 tablets, consecrated altar tablets that represent, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Ark of the Covenant itself. Each tablet is considered so sacred that it is permanently veiled and can only be viewed by ordained priests. Even Ethiopian clergy cannot look directly at another church's tablet. The British Museum has held these 11 tablets ever since, for over 150 years. They have never been publicly displayed. They have never been scientifically studied. They are believed to be kept in a sealed room accessible only to authorized Ethiopian clergy. Inside a private chapel in Rome called the Sancta Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies, there is an ancient icon of Christ that the church describes as not made by human hands. According to tradition, it was begun by Saint Luke and completed by angels. It has been venerated since at least the 6th century and is considered one of the most sacred images in Catholicism. It is kept permanently inside an elaborate sealed case encrusted with silver, gold, and precious stones. The case is almost never opened. When scholars were last permitted to examine the icon directly in 1907, they reported that the image had faded to almost nothing, almost entirely visible. The Vatican has not permitted another examination since. What exactly is inside that ornate case right now, and whether there is anything still visible to see, nobody outside a very small circle of Vatican officials actually knows. At the far end of St. Peter's Basilica, there is an enormous golden throne sculpture by Bernini, inside which the church has always claimed rests the actual wooden chair used by the Apostle Peter, the first pope. In 1968, under Pope Paul VI, the chair was carefully removed from the sculpture and examined by scholars. What they found was not what the legend required. The examination concluded that the oldest identifiable parts of the chair date to approximately the 6th century at the earliest, not the 1st century, not Peter's lifetime. The ivory decorative panels appeared to depict imagery from ancient pagan mythology rather than Christian iconography. The study was completed, the results were published in academic journals in the 1970s without Vatican fanfare, and the chair was placed back inside Bernini's sculpture. In November 2024, the chair was briefly put on display for the first time in 150 years. The Vatican described it as the chair of St. Peter. The 1968 examination was not mentioned. The Spear of Destiny, the lance allegedly used by the Roman soldier Longinus to pierce the side of Jesus during the crucifixion. The Vatican's version is kept inside a hollow statue of Saint Longinus in St. Peter's Basilica and displayed once a year during the first week of Lent. Briefly, from a balcony at height. No independent scientific examination of the Vatican's lance has been permitted in the modern era. There are at least 3 other lances across Europe claiming to be the same relic in Vienna, Krakow, and Armenia. Scientists tested the Vienna lance and found it dates to around the 7th century. The Vatican's version remains undated, which is either because the Church doesn't want to know or because they already do. I need you to understand that this one is real, and it was venerated by the Catholic Church for nearly 1,000 years, and the Vatican's current official position is we are not discussing this. The holy prepuce is the foreskin of Jesus, removed at his circumcision 8 days after his birth. In medieval Christianity, it was one of the most venerated relics in the world. Charlemagne claimed to have received it as a gift from an angel. Multiple churches across Europe claimed to possess it simultaneously. At one point, there were up to 18 competing holy prepuces on the continent. The church was apparently fine with this. Then the Protestant Reformation happened, and Protestants began mocking the relic aggressively and publicly. The church quietly began backing away. In 1900, the Vatican issued an official decree threatening excommunication for anyone who wrote or spoke about it publicly. The most prominent relic had been kept since the 16th century in the small Italian village of Calcutta. In 1983, the village priest announced it had been stolen from his bedroom. It has never been recovered.
In at number 4.